All right, let's go ahead and finish off this chapter. I am going to cut out some information that I did have in the outline just because we're starting to approach that 90-minute mark. And so I want to kind of not give you guys too much more. And so you're not going to be responsible for the equity carve-outs. So we'll skip that. What we will talk about, though, is the other ways to raise funds in capital markets. I'll cover these very, very briefly. The way that you would see this on the exam is, you know how I like to do those drop-down boxes to where like I give you the description and then you identify which one best kind of fits that description. Kind of like what I did with the decision rules in the last exam. That's probably how you would see these. So we will cover this section. There's a few of these to go through. We won't look at the other investment banking activities. Of course, investment banks provide services to firms other than just underwriting. Is basically all you need to know. But the main thing they do is underwriting. And that's kind of, the unique thing that they do with firms. And then we will talk about the decision to going private, all right, which is different than private placement. This is like if I was a firm that was private to start, issued some public securities, and now I want to go back to just being a private firm. All right. So before we can do all that, we got to look at some preliminary decisions that a firm has to make when they want to decide to raise funds. So we know with an IPO, it's one way I can raise funds, right? But IPOs only happen the first time I go public or I start selling public securities. And most funds are not raised with IPOs. So for example, in 2016, U.S. companies raised $1.5 trillion with a T, $1 trillion in bonds and $197 billion in equity. Now notice bonds accounted for trillions of dollars, equity only accounted for $200 billion. That's a big difference. If you ever do any kind of money in banking class, I know when I teach money in banking, we would talk about it a little bit, that because of things like adverse selection and moral hazard, basically information asymmetry problems, debt contracts are actually more popular than equity contracts. Equity is just the attention grabber. Equity is the sexy security, right? The stock market gets talked about all the time. Whereas you never hear anything about the bond market, even though the bond market is so much larger than the stock market. It's not always a size thing, I guess. Stock is just more popular for people to talk about. Anyways, but from that 1.697 trillion total debt and equity, only 1% came from IPOs. Not a lot. IPOs get a lot of attention. Some years you have a lot more IPOs than other years, but that is not how firms acquire most of their money. So, what are some other ways we can do that? Well, before we look at those ways, the first thing we'll do is look at these preliminary decisions that have to be made. First of all, I have to figure out how much do I want to raise. That sounds like a good thing to know, right? Obviously. After that, I have to figure out the types of securities that I would like to issue. So do I want to issue common stock, preferred stock, bonds, hybrid securities? What do I want to do? Do I want to do a combination of them? Do I want to issue public securities that have to be registered? Or do I want to do private placements? Now, this is where the wording, I wish we used different words. We can be a publicly traded firm and issue public securities, which means they can be traded by anyone in that secondary market. Or I can do a private placement of either equity or debt. And that would be an unregistered security. And then that can't be traded. Right? That's what is with my accredited or am I qualified investors? So I can be a public firm with private securities, but I can't be a private firm with public securities. Like, once you have a public security, you're a public firm. You may choose to issue some private securities, but you're still a public firm. And so you can do it one way, but you can't do it the other. You can't be a private firm and just be like, oh yeah, I just have some public securities on the side. They'd be like, no, sorry, you're public. So be careful with that. Just make sure that's straight in your brain. We have to figure out if we're going to go with a competitive bid or a negotiated deal. Basically, the company has to figure out if it's going to sell its securities to the highest bidder, right? That's the competitive bid. Or should it negotiate a deal with the investment bank? So competitive bid, you just go to the highest bidder. Negotiated deal, you go directly and you work with an investment bank and you negotiate a deal. The competitive bid process is only available if a firm is extremely popular, to the point where the investment banks already know basically all they need to know about the firm and feel comfortable making a bid, right? And so your book lists that only about 100 of the largest firms can do the competitive bid. Just because for an investment bank to be comfortable making a bid, they already have to know the company basically, right? They already have to have done due diligence on that company. And the large firms, this is fine, right? The investment banks will know the firms. They would have worked with them in the past. But for everyone else, it's usually done as a negotiated deal, because it's just too expensive for the investment bank to have done that due diligence and place a bid that they could lose out on. And so negotiated deal is what most firms do. Only the very, very popular large firms that investment banks already know will get the bids. And then what's going to happen is that we're going to need to select an investment bank. So since most of them are negotiated, right, I have to go out and select an investment bank to work with. Of course, for the first time when I go public, that's going to be the most, difficult search, right? Just because I don't have an established relationship. But when I go back to do subsequent offerings and raise more capital, it should be a much easier process since there's already established relationship, unless I don't like the services I had previously and want to change. We also know that when we select an investment bank, some investment banks are more specialized in certain industries, so that could have an impact on your selection. And then finally, the analyst that's going to be assigned to your firm can often come into play. Like, you want to make sure you have a good analyst who's going to make that secondary market function well for your stock and make sure that it's liquid, that it's being well traded, all that great stuff. So before we even get into this process of all these other ways to raise funds, I got to go through these initial steps first. So next thing we'll do is we'll go through these. We have 1, 2, 3, I think 4, 5, 6. So 6 different ways we can kind of raise money. I'll try to do like 3 and 3. And then we got to talk about private placement. So hopefully just 3 more videos and we'll be done with all the material finally. Whew.